Welcome to the Weekend University podcast, and this is your host, Niall McKeever. The Weekend University was set up to make the best psychology lectures available to the general public. To do this, we organise lecture days once per month, where attendees get a full day of talks from the UK's leading psychologists, authors, and university professors. Our podcast features in-depth interviews with our speakers, so you can learn more about their work. To keep updated on upcoming events and new lectures, you can sign up for the mailing list at theweekenduniversity.com. In this episode, we're joined by Dr. Steve Taylor. Steve is a senior lecturer in psychology at Leeds Beckett University and the author of several best-selling books on psychology and spirituality, including Making Time, The Leap, and Spiritual Science, which was published earlier this year. Eckhart Tolle has described his work as an important contribution to the shift in consciousness that is happening on our planet, and he has twice been named in Mind, Body, Spirit magazine's list of the 100 spiritually most influential living people. In this episode, we discuss the psychology of near-death experiences, Steve's advice for uncovering your purpose, why Dr. Taylor has never worked more than 3 days per week in his life, Steve's views on consciousness and spiritual experiences, and a whole lot more. Dr. Taylor will be the second speaker at our upcoming Science and Spirituality event, which is taking place at the University of London on Sunday the 28th of October. You can save 10% on your ticket if you use the code PODCAST when registering. Enjoy the show. All right, so Steve, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
To get started, could you just tell me a bit more about your background and how you got so interested in spirituality and the books you're currently writing?
It was originally down to my personal experiences. At the age of 16 or 17, I started to experience unusual states of consciousness, which I didn't understand at the time. So they were moments when I felt a strong sense of connection to nature. I felt a sort of strong desire to be in natural surroundings, to be in quietness and peaceful surroundings. And when I was in those surroundings, I'd feel a tremendous sense of connection to the sky or to the trees around me. And a kind of a feeling of harmony and kind of euphoria almost. And that happened a lot, but I didn't really understand the experiences at the time. My background was kind of very non-religious, non-spiritual. And I didn't really have a context to make sense of those experiences. So at the time, I thought there was something wrong with me because I felt different to other people and I was experiencing these strange states of consciousness. But later on, I realized that these experiences were not uncommon, that a lot of people also had them. And then I realized when I read books on spirituality and mysticism, maybe when I was in my early 20s, I realized that there were actual whole philosophies built around these experiences, and that people in different cultures and in different centuries had the same experiences. So eventually, when I decided to become a psychologist, then one of the things I wanted to do was to do research on these experiences. I called them awakening experiences. Well, you mean other people call them spiritual experiences, but I called them awakening experiences because I realized from my own experiences and from other people's experiences that they tended to happen in kind of non-religious, non-spiritual context, just in the midst of everyday life, in normal activities, and usually to people who knew nothing about spirituality or religion. So I saw them as a kind of natural feature of human experience, which some people interpret into spirituality or religion. But in any case, that was the main reason why I became a psychologist, to study these types of ecstatic experience.
Very interesting. And I heard in another interview you did online that whenever you were around the age of 20, you went through a period where you were quite difficult on yourself, and you were doing things like you were taking cold baths, you were sleeping on a hard floor and stuff. Could you tell me a bit more about that period and why you think you went through that stage?
Yeah, again, at the time, I didn't really understand what I was doing. Basically, I was at university. I was at the University of Warwick. I was about 20 years old, probably in my second or third year. My third year, I think. And I just felt this impulse to kind of pare my life down to its most basic stage. I wanted to kind of get rid of everything in my life apart from the most basic things. So I cut myself off from other people. I lived in a bedsit and had very little contact with other people. I got rid of most of my possessions. Everything I owned, I could put in one sort of large bag. And I felt this urge to sort of test myself, or sort of almost inflict challenges and difficulties on myself. And I didn't know why. Again, it was totally instinctive. But I guess when I think about it now, it was partly a desire to kind of become free of the environment I've been brought up in. I was trying to sort of, find out who I really was. And that meant sort of taking everything away to find out what was left at the end of that process. And I think I was also trying to develop some willpower too. It was a question of sort of trying to become self-disciplined as well. I think it was a desire to sort of reduce life to its most essential form so that I could begin again and kind of rebuild from that point.
It sounds like you were practicing stoicism without even knowing what you were doing. And do you think on a spiritual path, that's important for people? That's an important stage for people to go through? Is that something almost like something that has to be done?
I don't know if it's an important stage for everybody, but certainly for some people, it's an important stage. I mean, it happens later on, years later, when I read about mystics and spiritual traditions, I read about asceticism, which was a very, in every spiritual tradition, particularly in Hinduism and in Christian mysticism, asceticism is seen as a kind of essential stage of spiritual development. And again, it's very similar to what I was doing. It's a question of sort of, in its extreme form, it means inflicting pain on yourself. Like the Christian saints who would wear hair shirts and belts with nails that stuck into their skin. It becomes quite perverse, in its extreme form. But in Hinduism, for example, in the Hindu tradition, it's a question of developing, to some degree, it's a question of developing self-discipline. But it's also a question of awakening energies in the body by sort of reducing your dependence on your senses and by becoming more kind of detached from sensory pleasures and comforts. You build up an inner energy, a kind of inner spiritual energy. And I guess from my own experience, I can understand that. I think maybe subconsciously I was trying to do that, build up this inner spiritual energy. But it depends on the tradition. Some traditions don't recommend that, and some people don't seem to need that. I mean, the other way of looking at it is that one thing I've looked at a lot in my research is how suffering and psychological turmoil can give rise to personal transformation. There are a lot of cases of people who've been diagnosed with cancer, who've been addicts, who've suffered bereavement. And in the midst of that intense psychological suffering, they sometimes undergo a transformation. So I sometimes think if, in some people's experiences and in some traditions, that period of inflicting suffering on yourself, maybe they're trying to do something similar. They're trying to sort of create or generate some kind of inner transformation by inflicting suffering on themselves.
Very interesting. I know that you spent some time in East Germany when in your 20s as a musician. Could you tell us a bit more about that period and the significance of that in your overall kind of life's direction?
Yeah, it was quite an austere time at that period in East Germany. They were just recovering from 45 years of communism. And I was living quite an austere life too. I was living a very kind of hand-to-mouth existence. I didn't have a bank account. I had no sort of official identity, no driving license and nothing. I was just living a hand-to-mouth existence as a musician, earning very little money, but it cost very little money to live at that time in Eastern Germany. But also, as a musician, I was living quite a hedonistic lifestyle too, doing a lot of drinking and smoking, a lot of late nights, a lot of hanging around. But there's one particular evening, one night when I used to go to bars. I was at a bar until about 4 o'clock in the morning. and went to bed about 5 o'clock in the morning. And I woke up maybe an hour after I'd gone to bed. Maybe at 6 o'clock in the morning, it was still dark. And I had this incredible feeling of freedom and euphoria. And I felt in some ways I was outside my body, but at the same time I wasn't. I was kind of both inside and outside my body. And I felt kind of limitless, as if my identity or my being was stretching kind of limitlessly through space. And I was almost aware of the whole universe. Somehow I could sense the enormity of the whole universe kind of stretching around me. And there was just this incredibly deep feeling of peace, as if I was kind of floating on this kind of ocean of bliss. And I had this strong sense, strong awareness too, that this was the kind of basic, essential reality of the universe. It was a really strong, strong awareness that this sort of incredibly strong feeling of euphoria was in some way the essence of things. There was a kind of harmony. The whole universe seemed to be, immersed in harmony. And it was so powerful. It was, probably still to this day, the most powerful spiritual experience I've had. And because at that time, as I said, I was living a kind of dissolute life, I moved away from my earlier kind of ascetic or kind of spiritual lifestyle. So in some way, it was a powerful reminder of what I thought I'd lost, but it was obviously still there inside me and outside me. And in some ways, after that, it changed my life, and I began to move back towards a spiritual lifestyle.
Very cool. So a lot of your work over your life has focused on, I suppose, awakening experiences, and you've read a book on the psychology of spiritual awakening. But even the use of the term awakening suggests that the normal state for human beings to be in is a kind of autopilot, a kind of sleep. Do you think this is the case? And if so, what do you think causes this? And has it always been like this? Have we always been in this sort of like semi-asleep state? And yeah, could you just talk a bit more about that?
I think that's true. I feel strongly that human beings' most normal state is to be asleep, to be asleep is maybe a bit strong, but partially awake, half asleep maybe. And I think there are two main ways in which that manifests itself. One is in what I sometimes call automatized perception. Most human beings tend to take life for granted. We take the world for granted. Our surroundings are familiar to us. The basic experiences of our lives are familiar to us. And our lives consist of a lot of repetition and repeating the same experiences with the same people in the same environments. So we live under this kind of veil of familiarity. The world is half real to us because it's so familiar. And I think that's one of the reasons why we love to go on holiday, because when we go on holiday, the surroundings are unfamiliar and we wake up a little bit. The world becomes more real. It's like, this is fresh, it's exciting because it's more real. And it's also why we love new experiences, because new experiences also wake us up a little bit. It's like, these are real, and we're back to reality for a short time. But unfortunately, we always return to familiarity. And that extends to very basic perceptions, like looking at the sky or looking at the trees around us. We don't really see them in their isness. We see a kind of half real, kind of shady reality, which is like a very poor quality photocopy of reality itself. And that becomes normal as this kind of automatized perception becomes normal. And it means that we take life itself for granted, the fact of being alive in the world, in this strange, wonderful place with these strange and wonderful people around us, and all the kind of weird phenomena about, that human life consists of. We take all of it for granted.
Is there anything people can do to kind of like snap themselves out of it and stop taking everyday life for granted so much? Like to start appreciating the small things, appreciating nature, appreciating the people in our lives.
Yeah, definitely. But I think that's the whole aim of mindfulness, is to actually cultivate a fresh awareness of our experience, to actually be aware of what we're doing rather than being perceiving the world through a haze of abstraction and familiarity. So, things like meditation, mindfulness, I think, that is the essential aim of these practices, is to wake us up to the reality of the world, the reality of our experience. But there are lots of other things too. I think you mentioned nature. Contact with nature can have this effect too. It sort of really, nature has a kind of stilling effect. It calms our minds down, relaxes us, and it kind of intensifies our perceptions. So we become, more aware of our experience. And that's the reason why one of the reasons why we love to go into nature, because it wakes us up. And apart from that, there's a lot of research in psychology that talks about the benefits of cultivating an awareness of cultivating a sense of gratitude. There are various exercises you can practice to kind of stop taking life for granted. And one of them is cultivating an awareness of death. I think one of the reasons why we take life for granted is because we aren't aware of death. Death is a kind of, we know we're going to die, but subconsciously we don't really think we're going to die. We think we're going to be here forever. So often a reminder of death is like, wow, I am going to die, and therefore this world is temporary. It's, my life is fragile and temporary, and therefore it's precious. And the people in my life are also precious because they're temporary as well. Our relationships are all temporary. So, cultivating an awareness of death is a really good way of, overcoming, I call it the taking for granted syndrome, taking life for granted.
Okay. I heard in your TED talk that you experienced a car crash, and it was almost like a near-death experience. And afterwards, you had sort of like a shift in consciousness almost. You started you started appreciating things more. And I was wondering, is there any research that has been done into the psychological effects of near-death experiences, and can they bring about a positive change in people's day-to-day lives?
Definitely, yeah. I've done some studies on the subject. I've done studies on the effects of intense psychological turmoil, such as a diagnosis of cancer, or becoming severely disabled, or bereavement. So in many cases, it involves an awareness of death or an encounter with death. My research has shown that encounters with death, for some people, not for everybody, but for some people, they can be profoundly life-changing. A diagnosis with cancer, for some people, it can be obviously an incredibly, for everybody to some extent, it's incredibly anxious and desperate experience. But some people also experience a kind of transformation. Going back to awareness of death, it's the first time for some people that they're really aware of death, and they're really aware of the temporariness of life. So becoming aware of the temporariness of life can be a profound experience. And it really means becoming aware of the value of everything around you. Just to give you an example, there's one person in my research, she was diagnosed with cancer, and she was told it was a very aggressive form of cancer and that she may only have a few months left to live. But straight away, as soon as she was told that, she experienced a kind of transformation. She looked around her and realized that life was a temporary gift that was going to be taken away from her. And suddenly the whole world, all of her surroundings became incredibly real and beautiful. The trees vibrating on the branches of the tree. Sorry, the leaves vibrating on the branches of the trees, the clouds floating by in the sky. Everything became incredibly real, incredibly beautiful. And I think it's really about, it's largely about cultivating a sense of presence, becoming completely present. And a lot of things fall away, worrying about the future falls away, being concerned with the past, feeling guilty or bitter about the past, all that falls away. So you're left with the present, and the present becomes incredibly real, incredibly beautiful. And it brings out, and usually it's not just a temporary transformation, it becomes a permanent, ongoing state.
Yeah. I'd be curious to ask you, Steve, what does the word enlightenment mean to you? And what are some common and frustrating myths you find around waking up and the enlightenment process?
Well, I prefer the word wakefulness to enlightenment. I think enlightenment is kind of a mistranslation. Um, it's usually associated with Buddhism. But in Buddhism, the word for this state is much closer to the literal translation is wakefulness rather than enlightenment. So if you think in terms of wakefulness, it means an expansion and an intensification of awareness. And every spiritual tradition has some sort of equivalent term which means roughly wakefulness. So in Hinduism, there's a state called Sahaja Samadhi. In Taoism, there's a state called Ming. Christian mystical traditions, Jewish mystical traditions have a similar term. And yeah, in some sense, it's all about a state in which we're more aware of reality and more in contact, more connected to the world. So for me, this state of wakefulness, you can think about it in terms of different qualities which arise in this state. And one very important quality is a transcendence of the sense of separation. So going back to the idea of being asleep, the second aspect of sleep is really our human beings' normal sense of separateness, our sense that we are living inside our own mental space, inside our own bodies, in duality to the world. The world seems to be out there, we're in here, and there's a duality, there's a boundary between us. But in wakefulness, that boundary falls away. It's not as though we cease to exist as individuals. We still exist, we still have an identity, but we are no longer separate to the world around us. There's a sense of a kind of a flowing participation or connection, or even a sense of unity, so that we realize that our identity includes everything which seems to be out there, including other people. We share our identity with other human beings. And that's one quality. And there are other qualities too, like a very strong sense of compassion, which arises from that sense of connection, strong sense of altruism. And also things like a transcendence of the sense of group identity. So people who wake up, they no longer feel that they are part of a certain ethnic group or a certain national group or a certain sort of political affiliation. Those things just fall away. And if they have any sense of affiliation at all, it's just to the human race in general. So there's no sense of differentiation between different groups of people. And also there's a sense of kind of stillness and inner stillness. I think people who wake up, they still think to some degree, but usually their minds are quieter than other people's. There's a sense of kind of inner expansion, a kind of spaciousness inside them. Kind of spaciousness and a quietness within their beings. So, I mean, there are many. I think in my book, The Leap, I identify about 24 different characteristics of wakefulness. So there are lots more qualities as well.
Very interesting. You've done a lot of work on the importance of purpose for psychological well-being. I'd be curious to ask, how do you see your own purpose in the world?
Well, again, it's something which is kind of instinctive or impulsive. So it's not something I've sort of consciously deliberated over so much. But for me, my purpose is, it's something which kind of flows through me rather than something which I try to consciously cultivate or which I consciously follow. It's something which kind of arises inside me and which I try to allow to express itself. And it expresses itself through my writings, through creativity. And I see my role as just to kind of facilitate it, just to allow it to express itself. And, I can think about where is it going? What is expressing itself? What's the direction it's heading in? And if I ponder over that, then it seems to be, I think there's kind of the basic purpose of everything I write and the kind of the impulses I feel. It's to maybe sounds a little pompous if I say it, but I see my role as trying to sort of facilitate a shift
Okay.
in human consciousness, to try to contribute to a process of awakening. This idea of awakening is kind of central to everything I do, and I feel that in some way my role is to help facilitate a collective process of awakening. I think a lot of people are working in the same direction, but I think hopefully I'm contributing to that process as well.
So it's almost as if whatever this thing is, your purpose or whatever, you're allowing that to flow through you or flow through your work into the world. Um, what parts of the work that you do does that come through strongest? Is it during your writing? Is it your speaking? What points or what parts of your work do you feel most alive? Is my question.
I think primarily through my writing, um, and also through my research. As a psychologist, there are certain things which I feel impelled to research, and there are certain things as a university researcher and lecturer, there are certain things where you have to research where you're not particularly, um, they're not particularly organic. You have to sort of follow the process and do certain things sometimes. But when I follow my own research goals, I feel very impelled to research certain things, like, for example, transformational experiences. I've just completed a research project on transformational experiences related to bereavement, where we spoke to 16 people who'd undergone some sort of profound personal transformation after the loss of a loved one. And also another research project I'm thinking of is I've heard a lot of reports of transformational experiences in soldiers in conflict situations. So that's something I feel impelled to investigate as well. So that's one direction. But books, I find books quite interesting because it's very rare. I've written 11 books now, and apart from maybe a couple of exceptions, they kind of grow very organically. I don't sort of consciously make a decision to write a book on a certain subject. They kind of grow very slowly and organically inside me, and almost as if it's unconscious. And my role is just to, as you said before, just to kind of facilitate the bit like being a midwife. I'm the midwife of the book. There's a long period of gestation, a bit like pregnancy. Mind you, I said this to my wife, though. I feel like sometimes the process of writing a book is a bit like being pregnant. She wasn't very pleased about that, having been through pregnancies herself. but yeah, there is some kind of analogy. I wrote a book called The Fall, which is I think it's my second book, but it's my first book that was published with a mainstream publisher. That came out about 13 years ago now. But it was quite strange. It took me 3 years to write, and all the time I wasn't really aware of what I was doing, wasn't really aware of where it was going, but it was almost as if I felt deeply impelled to write it. And it was sort of almost like it was coming through me rather than me consciously writing it.
Very interesting. Now, is there anything, you probably get asked this question all the time, but is there anything people can do to kind of uncover their own purpose? If someone's listening to this and they want to contribute to the world, but they're not exactly sure how to go about it, what do you recommend to someone like that?
Well, I think there are many times in our lives when we can take on a kind of external purpose, which isn't really organic to us, but we feel the need to please other people, or maybe to follow the conventions of society. So maybe you may decide that you want to be a lawyer because of pressure from your family or something similar. But usually, eventually, if you're not following your natural purpose, you will eventually become aware of it. There'll be a sense of frustration, a sense of confusion, a kind of deep knowing that you're not living in an authentic way. But a lot of people repress those feelings, and it can be, maybe they can reach middle age, and only then in middle age do they realize that they've been following an inauthentic purpose, a purpose which is not right for them. I think sometimes that's what midlife crisis is. It's when people realize that they've not been living organically or authentically.
You said earlier that you're at the minute you're really interested by uh, the transformative experiences soldiers go through after they've been in a conflict situation and things like that there. Um, how important do you think it is for people to kind of tap into their curiosity and sort of follow their interests to kind of get them towards doing what they should be doing? It's almost like whenever we do that, whenever we follow our curiosity more, it's like we're tapping into something that's sort of like our future selves is drawing us towards, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's how I felt originally when I kind of followed the impulse to be a writer or a psychologist. I felt as though something was drawing me towards it. But it's easy to to take the wrong path, usually due to kind of social pressures. Sometimes it's to do with not feeling confident enough or strong enough to follow your own impulses. But it's important to to be sensitive to your own reactions to what you're doing. If you feel a little twinge of frustration, sometimes you may repress it or try to override it. But it's important to follow, to find out the root of your frustration and to allow it to express itself. And usually, it can sometimes lead to a lot of psychological discord. The realization or the slow sort of the slow realization that you're not living in the way you're supposed to. But once you face that, it will guide you in the right direction. Sometimes it takes a little bit of strength, a bit of a leap of faith to give up your present path and follow a more authentic path. It involves risks. It involves giving up. It may involve giving up security, even financial security. But you have to do it. Life is temporary. Even if you believe in some kind of life after death, life in this form is very temporary. It's fragile. So we can't afford to spend our lives doing things that we're not meant to do.
Have there been any moments in your life where you've taken a leap like that and things have changed for you?
Um, well, I like to think that I've always sort of followed an authentic path. Um, I've always tried to follow my creativity and I've always tried to avoid a conventional way of life. One of my proudest achievements is that I've never worked more than 3 days a week in a job. So,
Wow.
even now, I only work 3 days a week at my university.
Really?
Because I was always aware that I needed time. The main thing in my life was to allow my creativity or my spirituality to express itself, and I wanted time to do that. So
Wow.
I always kind of avoided, full-time work. And I always sort of tried to make my life as simple as possible and try to live off as little money as possible so that I had more time to express myself or to follow my own interests. But at the same time, probably the most significant decision of my life was when I decided to go back to university to do a master's degree in psychology. And that led to a kind of whole new life. After my period of being a musician and kind of drifting from place to place, once I committed to returning to academia, then a whole new life opened for me.
Wow. Okay. So it sounds like what you're saying, that it's very important, at least for you, to have space in your life so that these things, like that you can, that will help you uncover whatever your purpose is supposed to be, I suppose.
Definitely, yeah. I mean, I think we really underestimate the importance of space and quiet time and stillness in our lives. That's why I don't come from a Jewish background, but I like the idea of the Jewish idea of the Sabbath. The one day of the week where you let go of activity and busyness and kind of try to be rather than to do. I think the more time we can spend being, the better.
For sure. For sure. Now, you could argue that nowadays we live in the the predominant worldview could be said to be materialist. And I wanted to ask, what do you think the dangers are of of having this worldview? Are that like, is it making us more nihilistic? Do we think the universe is just blind energy? You know, like, what are the effects that has on people's psychology, and why is it important for us to start to see the world in a different way?
Yeah, I think one issue is that it leads to a devaluation of life and the world. I mean, I think on the one hand, being materialist, in a sense, it can make you aware of the preciousness of life, you know, because obviously materialism suggests that our identity or our mind is just a product of the brain. So that when the brain dies, it's the end of our existence. So obviously there's no life after death. So, you know, rejecting the idea of life after death can make you more aware of the preciousness of this life. I think Richard Dawkins says this a lot. You know, I'm not by no means a great fan of, or any fan at all of Richard Dawkins, but I kind of quite like his emphasis on, you know, this world is fragile, it's temporary, it's a place of wonder. We're only here for a short time, so we should be aware of the wonder of it. That's wonderful. That's great. And Nietzsche said something similar. Nietzsche said that by rejecting the Christian idea of the afterlife, we bring more value to this life because it's all we have. And, you know, Nietzsche rejected Christianity because he felt it was a devaluation of life. And that's great. But in practice, that doesn't actually happen. You know, you don't get sort of many people, maybe they should be aware of the wonder of life, but in practice, materialism often leads to a sense of hedonism and consumerism. You know, this life is all we have, therefore we should just enjoy ourselves. You know, what can we do but just drink as much as we can, go on as many holidays as we can, just have a good time because, you know, there's nothing else. And, you know, that involves buying as many products as we can and buying the latest clothes, the latest kitchen equipment. So kind of philosophical materialism leads to, you know, actual consumerist materialism. There's a very strong link between them. There's really no other value in life apart from what we can get out of it. You know, if basically life is valueless, it's just a kind of a small space, an accidental space between birth and death, and we're just genetic machines who are designed to kind of reproduce, and that's all. Then there's really nothing for us to do. You know, life has no meaning, no purpose except to have a good time. So, you know, so materialism doesn't make life more meaningful, really. It makes human beings more kind of competitive, more materialistic, and more mean, if you like. And also, I think it leads to a destructive attitude to the environment too, because, you know, the environment, nature is kind of mechanistic. Natural things are basically chemical machines, just as we are. Therefore, you know, they really have no value apart from what we can make of them, what we can use them for. So I think materialism kind of promotes a subtle, destructive attitude to the environment as well.
Well, how do you see the world, Steve? What's your worldview, and what's the worldview you talk about in your new book, Spiritual Science?
Well, my view is that the fundamental reality of the universe is not matter, but consciousness, or maybe you could call it spirit. So I sometimes call it fundamental consciousness. So I think that, you know, the basic reality of the universe is a fundamental consciousness, which means that consciousness is kind of embedded into the fabric of the universe. Consciousness is a fundamental quality which was always there, just like gravity or mass or other physical forces. Consciousness is similar to that in that it was, you know, it's everywhere and it was always there in the universe. Or maybe even consciousness is more fundamental than the universe. Maybe fundamental consciousness in some way gives rise to the physical universe. It's kind of like the source of the physical universe. But in any case, once you kind of posit the idea that there is this kind of fundamental consciousness, and, you know, and many philosophers, many cultures throughout history have accepted that idea as many indigenous cultures, you know, the Native Americans called it the Great Spirit or the Great Mystery. Many indigenous cultures in the world had this sense that the basic reality of the universe was this spirit, which kind of expressed itself in all of nature and also within human beings. And once you kind of posit this idea, then it makes there are many things which become easier to explain, like kind of our own consciousness, for example, things like altruism, human altruism, spiritual experiences, near-death experiences, all of these things become easier to explain.
And what's your view on spiritual experiences? Do you think it's, I'm pretty sure you don't, but do you think it's just unusual activity in the brain, or what do you think is actually going on when someone's having a spiritual experience?
Well, I mean, some people have tried to explain spiritual experiences in terms of unusual brain activity. There's one theory that it's quite a popular theory that it's related to activity in temporal lobes of the brain. And some people make a comparison to some people with epilepsy of temporal lobe seizures. Allegedly, they sometimes have mystical experiences. But there's really no evidence of this. In fact, there's a lot of evidence against it. A lot of people, many epileptic people do not have any experiences akin to mystical or spiritual experiences. There's really no strong connection between temporal lobe activity and spiritual experiences. In fact, nobody has really any idea of what the brain correlates of spiritual experiences are. There don't seem to be any clear correlates. So my feeling is that these experiences are not brain-based experiences. I think that going back to the idea of fundamental consciousness, I think that rather than believing that the consciousness is produced by brain activity, that consciousness is a kind of shadow of brain activity, I think another way of looking at it, which is a lot of psychologists and philosophers would now consider this to be a kind of viable alternative way of looking at consciousness. One way of looking at it is to suggest that consciousness is some kind of fundamental feature of the universe, and that the function of our brains is not to produce consciousness, but to kind of canalize consciousness into our own individual being. So universal consciousness is all around us as a kind of fundamental quality. And the purpose of our brains, of our brain cells and the networks of our brains, is to allow that fundamental force to express itself individually within us so that we become individually conscious.
Wow.
And
So would I be right in saying it's almost like we're antenna that are tuning into consciousness?
yeah, exactly. Yeah. Consciousness is kind of transmitted through the brain into our individual beings. And that's why, many spiritual experiences, there's a strong sense of connection and oneness. There's a sense that in some way, especially in very deep awakening experiences, there's a sense that our own identity kind of dissolves into the universe as a whole. A bit like a drop of rain falling to the ocean and disappearing to the ocean. There's a sense that we dissolve into a kind of a universal consciousness. Our own individual consciousness dissolves into a universal consciousness, and that is essentially exactly what is happening. We are experiencing our own fundamental oneness. There's a certain point in a deep state of meditation, for example, when we make contact with the kind of the purest essence of our being, which is fundamental consciousness. And at that purest essence, we are literally one with the whole universe, because we reach a point where we experience our fundamental oneness with the whole universe.
Okay. And has there been any research done into whether the mind can heal the body?
Yeah, and this is one of the things which the standard model, the kind of materialistic model of science, struggles to explain, because the mind is basically a kind of shadow of the brain, and therefore it shouldn't really have any influence over the brain or the body. You wouldn't expect the images on a computer screen to be able to affect the internal workings of the computer, because it's just produced by the computer. It shouldn't really be able to affect the kind of hardware of the computer itself.
Yeah.
But in effect, that's what the mind of the body, and the brain as well. What you do with your mind affects the structures of the brain, and what you do with your mind affects the functioning and the well-being of your body. So, this is traditionally known as the placebo effect in one of its manifestations. There's so much research showing that believing that you're likely to be healed engineers healing of some form. And it's not just belief, there's lots of evidence showing that actual healing does take place through the placebo effect, even to the extent of the phenomenon of sham surgery, where believing that you've undergone an operation can actually make the operation successful, even though nothing has actually happened. There's been no intervention from the surgeon.
There's been research done on that, yeah.
Yeah. There was there have been studies of the effectiveness of sham surgery when it's obviously quite unethical. Most of the research took place in the 1990s. But yeah, there've been sort of meta-analyses of all of the instances of sham surgery, which shows that they're almost as successful as normal surgery, kind of active surgery. And yeah, things like hypnosis. So it's well known that under hypnosis, people can experience a great deal of healing from some conditions, and also that hypnosis can have a very strong analgesic effect, pain-killing effect. But these are all instances in which belief or intention can have a very pronounced influence on the functioning of the body.
Yeah, okay. A few more questions before we finish up, Steve. I wanted to ask, how many books have you written in the past number of years?
Well, my first book was published in 2003, and so I've written 11 books since 2003.
Right. Okay. That's quite a track record. Have you got any advice for young writers now who would like to achieve similar things with their writing?
Well, writing is maybe like a lot of activities, a lot of creative activities. It's something that you have to do without considering the kind of the idea of success. You have to just feel a very strong impulse to do it, and the kind of the joy of it comes from the act of creativity rather than from the rewards. So if you think about the rewards of writing, then you won't get very far. You just have to sort of feel a strong impulse to create structured works of nonfiction or fiction, whatever it is. And that in itself, for me, it's a tremendous joy. The creative aspect of it is wonderful. It's and the rewards of writing can be quite thin. They can be quite scanty, and it involves a lot of rejection too. I started writing books in I can't remember exactly, but there was a long period before I actually became published when I continually received rejections and I was continually disappointed. But I just had a very strong impulse that this is what I wanted to do, and I continued. I didn't allow the rejections to discourage me. So I'd say it's very important not to be discouraged by any rejections, because that's inevitable. It can also take a long time for you to find your voice as well, to sort of, it's like any apprenticeship. It can take a long time to develop the skill of writing. It took me a long time. And again, I think the main thing, as I said earlier, you have to engage in the activity just for the joy of creation rather than considering the rewards of it.
Yeah. And what does your creative process look like whenever you've got an idea for a book you want to bring into the world? Practically, how do you go about that?
Well, as I said before, they normally take a long time to manifest themselves. So I have notebooks and journals. So whenever I have ideas, I sort of develop them in my journal. I make notes in my journal. And sometimes I'll just be sort of walking along the street, maybe waiting in a queue at a shop. And sometimes it'll just hit me. Said, that's an idea for a book. I can see the whole book kind of mapped out, almost like a sort of painting where you can see the positioning of everything in the painting. I can sort of see the whole structure of a book, and maybe like an architect, who sees a building, the kind of the plan of a building and the structure of a building. So it's quite sort of involuntary in a way. It just sort of appears. And once I have the basic structure in my mind, then it's normally, not such a difficult process, quite an easy process, although it's quite time consuming. It's a process of kind of filling out the structure, kind of building on that structure. So for me, usually it manifests itself in terms of chapters. I'll get an idea for a book, and I'll see the topic of each chapter. So maybe it'll be 10 chapters or 12 chapters, and I have a vision of how they kind of fit together.
Yeah.
And I also write poetry. That's one of my sort of hobbies, is writing poetry. But that's something different. That's much more kind of instantaneous and much more spontaneous.
Right. Okay. And what's next for you? You've got a book published now. It's just been published? Spiritual Science?
Yeah, it's just about to be published. It's published in September 2018.
Okay. And are there any ideas for future books that are kind of brewing at the minute, or what's the situation there?
Well, for the last few years, I've been doing some sort of ongoing research. I mentioned my research project on bereavement, and a future research project on transformational experiences in the context of war. And I've done similar kind of research on people who've undergone transformational experiences through following addiction, for example. And also I've been in contact recently with a couple of prisoners in America, people who've been confined in prison for decades, who've undergone transformational experiences too. So I've got a feeling that all these experiences will kind of come together in one book. Maybe I've got a feeling it may be called Extraordinary Awakenings. Okay. So I thought I had this vision of this sort of book a few weeks ago, that there may be a chapter on bereavement, a chapter on warfare, a chapter on prisoners' experiences, a chapter on addiction, and then diagnosis of cancer, and so on. So that'll be one of my next books at some point.
That'll be fascinating. Steve, I wanted to ask you as well, do you have any regular spiritual practices that you conduct on a daily basis or a weekly basis? Do you meditate regularly? How do you kind of keep in touch with a present state of mind?
I do meditate, yeah. I try to meditate at least once a day. I don't always do that. It depends on where I am. I find that, if I'm based at home, if I'm not traveling, then usually I meditate every day, sometimes twice a day if I've got the time. But also I like to sort of look after my body too. So I do yoga. Sometimes I do qigong, sort of Taoist Chinese exercises. And I like to go running as well. For me, running is a kind of spiritual practice, I'd say, because running can make me feel very, very aware of the kind of the beauty of my surroundings, makes everything become very real. And I think the rhythm of running is a bit like a mantra in meditation. Your mind slows down, and you become a bit of space seems to open up inside me. So it's the same with swimming as well. So I like to think of swimming and running as spiritual practices as well.
Sort of like a moving meditation almost.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, think of swimming, for example. When you're swimming, you're, to some extent, you become aware of the motion of your limbs in the water, the feeling of your limbs moving within the water. And the water is a kind of almost like a massaging effect because of the weight of against your limbs. And you become relaxed. And so, yeah, it is a kind of mindfulness meditation, I'd say.
Right. Okay. What books have had the biggest impact on your life? What books have you recommended most to other people?
One book I often recommend to people nowadays is a book called Irreducible Mind, which was produced by a group of people. And the main author was a guy called Edward Kelly, an American psychologist. It's quite in some ways, it's quite an academic book. It's quite long, so about 700 pages, but it's based on the ideas, similar to the idea I was mentioning earlier, the idea that consciousness is fundamental to the universe. And so mind is irreducible. You can't think of mind as being something like a product of the brain. Mind is in some way fundamental to the universe. And it looks at, psychic phenomena. It looks into creativity. kind of genius, the phenomenon of geniuses who have incredible creativity. It looks into things like hypnosis and the power of the mind to affect the body. And it's a really fantastic overview of all of the evidence suggesting that mind is not just the products of the brain, it's something fundamental in the universe. So that's one book I would recommend. And I think when I was younger, maybe the book which had the biggest impact on me was a book called The Outsider by Colin Wilson, which I read when I was about 19, I think. Okay. And it really, at the time, it really helped me to understand myself. It made me think that the state of being alienated from other people, of feeling different and not being able to fit in, that it wasn't something negative. It could actually be a positive syndrome. That it was actually a positive thing to be unable to fit into mainstream society. So that, I think that's also a very helpful book for people who are going through kind of a period of turbulence and people who have a lack of self-understanding.
For sure. This is a big question, but what's the best bit of advice you've ever received?
Well, one really good piece of advice I received was from a friend of mine, a guy called Russell Williams, who was he was kind of a spiritual teacher who I used to go to see in Manchester. And he unfortunately died about 4 months ago at the age of 96. So he had a long and productive life. But he said, one of his teaching was that he said simply, rather than paying attention to the content of your thoughts, just be aware of the process of thinking.
Okay.
So don't pay attention to what's in your thoughts. Just be aware of it as a process which is taking place in your mind, that you don't have to pay attention to its content.
Very cool. Very cool. Well, Steve, I think that's pretty much everything. You've got to talk with us on the 30th of October, I believe.
28th, I think, isn't it? Sunday the 28th.
I should really know that. So yeah.
Good job, I know it.
So yeah, I'm really looking forward to that. We'll include links for everything in the show notes for this. And I wanted to ask you as well, Steve, where can people find you online?
So the best place is my website, which is www.stephenmtaylor. So that's Stephen with a V, M for Mark, stephenmtaylor.com.
Well, Steve, thanks so much for your time, and I'm really looking forward to your talk in October.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed the show. Don't forget that you can win a 3-month pass worth £150 to the Weekend University if you subscribe and leave a review on iTunes. And if you're interested in keeping up to date with new psychology lectures and upcoming events, you can sign up for the mailing list at theweekenduniversity.com.